The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of cicadas as Judge Elijah Bennett eased his Mercedes down the quiet streets of Maplewood Estates. The long hours in court had drained him, but these evening drives were his sanctuary, a moment of peace away from the weight of his responsibilities. His reputation preceded him. Elijah had spent decades carving out a name for himself in the legal world, rising from a struggling law student to one of the most respected judges in the state. His success was a testament to his perseverance, a defiance of every statistic that had been stacked against him as a black man in America. But even the weight of his achievements couldn't shield him from the reality that no amount of success could erase the color of his skin. As the soft notes of Coltrane drifted through his speakers, Elijah loosened his tie and let out a sigh. It had been a tough case today, a wrongful conviction overturned after 5 years of a young man's life wasted behind bars. It was moments like these that reminded him why he took the bench in the first place. Justice, real justice, wasn't an easy thing to achieve. The red and blue lights flickered in his rear-view mirror, cutting through the night like a blade. His chest tightened. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a light. Yet here he was, with a slow, deliberate movement. Elijah signaled and pulled over, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. He had lived long enough to know that encounters like these weren't just routine for men who looked like him. The cruiser rolled up behind him, its engine growling as a figure stepped out, heavy boots crunching against the asphalt. A flashlight beam cut through the dim glow of his dashboard, illuminating his hands as they rested firmly on the steering wheel. A young officer, maybe mid-30s, approached his window. Square jaw, buzz cut, and a hardened stare that carried something Elijah had seen too often before: suspicion, license, and registration. The officer barked, no greeting, no explanation. Elijah moved slowly, every action deliberate, as he reached into the glove compartment. "Can I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" His voice was measured, professional. The officer narrowed his eyes. "Just routine. Hand over your documents." Elijah handed them over, watching as the officer barely glanced at them before flicking his gaze back to Elijah. "Step out of the car." There it was, the shift, the escalation. Elijah's jaw tightened. "Officer, I'd like to know the reason." I said, "Step out of the car." The officer's hand hovered near his holstered weapon. Elijah exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay composed. He had spent years teaching his children how to handle moments like this. Stay calm. Stay respectful. Don't give them a reason. And yet, no matter how much restraint he showed, the outcome was never guaranteed. With a slow nod, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, the cool night air brushing against his skin. The officer sized him up before gesturing toward the hood. Hands on the car. Elijah felt the familiar sting of humiliation rise in his chest, but he obeyed. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors from behind their curtains, their curiosity mixed with fear. "This car matches a description of a stolen vehicle," the officer muttered as he began patting Elijah down. Elijah's patience was wearing thin. "This is my car," he said, his voice clipped. "I've had it for over a year. If you run the plates, you'll see that." But the officer wasn't listening. Then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of handcuffs clicking open. That was the moment Elijah knew. This wasn't about a stolen car. It never had been. Before the cuffs touched his wrists, Elijah turned his head, his voice cutting through the night with quiet authority. "Before you do something you'll regret, I suggest you call your captain." The officer hesitated. "Do it," Elijah said again, his voice firm. "Now." For the first time, the officer faltered. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. He reached for his radio. The damage was already done. Elijah stood still, his hands resting on the hood of his car as the officer radioed in, his voice clipped and tense. The street was eerily silent except for the distant hum of an engine. Neighbors peeked from their windows, their silhouettes framed against dimly lit interiors. Elijah knew what they were thinking. Some were appalled, others indifferent, but none would step outside. The officer's radio crackled. "Officer Tyler, what's your status?" Tyler hesitated, then responded. "Routine stop. Suspected stolen vehicle." There was a pause, then a voice, firm and authoritative. "What's the suspect's name?" Tyler glanced at Elijah's driver's license and recited Elijah Bennett. The radio was silent for a moment. Then the voice came back, sharper this time. "Judge Elijah Bennett?" Tyler stiffened. Yes, sir." The response was immediate. "Release him now." Elijah saw it. The slight twitch in Tyler's jaw, the sudden stiffness in his shoulders. The officer had just realized he'd made a very big mistake. "Sir, you heard me, Officer Tyler. Release him immediately and wait for me at the scene." Tyler exhaled sharply and turned back to Elijah. The arrogance his posture had drained away, replaced by something else. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. "There's been a misunderstanding," he muttered, stepping back. Elijah slowly turned, his piercing gaze locked onto the officer's. "A misunderstanding?" His voice was quiet, but it carried an undeniable weight. Tyler shifted on his feet. "I was just following procedure." "No," Elijah interrupted, stepping closer. "You were profiling me. You didn't run my plates, didn't ask for any verification. You saw a black man in a nice car, and you assumed I stole it." Tyler's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. The sound of another vehicle approaching cut through the tension. A second police cruiser rolled up, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. Captain Richard Hayes. Hayes moved with purpose, his face grim as he approached. His eyes flicked between Elijah and Tyler before he spoke. "Judge Bennett," he said with forced politeness, "I sincerely apologize for this incident." Elijah crossed his arms. "Incident?" Hayes cleared his throat. "Mistake." Elijah shook his head. "A mistake is calling someone by the wrong name. What happened here wasn't a mistake. It was bias. It was a violation of my rights. And it's something I've seen too many times before." Hayes let out a slow breath. "Judge, I assure you, this will be handled internally." "No," Elijah interrupted, his tone unwavering. "Not this time." Hayes blinked, caught off guard. "I want a public acknowledgement," Elijah continued. "I want transparency, and I want action." Hayes hesitated. "Judge, let's be reasonable." "No." Elijah's voice cut to the air like a blade. "You don't get to ask me to be reasonable. Not when I was forced out of my own car, humiliated in front of my neighbors, and nearly handcuffed for no reason." Hayes ran a hand over his face, exhaling. He knew this wasn't going away quietly. "I'll set up a meeting," he finally said, "with the mayor and police commissioner. We can discuss next steps." Elijah nodded. "Do that, and make sure this officer is held accountable." Hayes shot a glare at Tyler before nodding. "This isn't over," Elijah said as he walked back to his car. "No, this was just the beginning." 2 days later, Elijah stood in front of a packed press conference. Cameras flashed. Reporters murmured. The entire city was watching. He took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. "My name is Judge Elijah Bennett," he began, "and I stand before you today not as a judge, but as a black man who was profiled by the very system that claims to serve and protect." The room fell silent. I was stopped, accused, and nearly handcuffed for nothing more than existing in my own neighborhood. This is not an isolated incident. It is a pattern, one that has cost innocent people their dignity, their freedom, and too often their lives. He paused, letting his words sink in. "I will not let this moment be swept under the rug. We demand accountability. We demand change." The crowd erupted in applause. This was no longer just about him. This was a movement, and Elijah was ready to lead it. In the weeks that followed, Elijah worked with local activists and city officials to push for police reform. Body cameras were mandated. Racial bias training became compulsory. Officer Tyler was suspended pending investigation. The change was small, but it was a step forward. One evening, as Elijah drove home, the jazz playing softly in the background, he felt a sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, he believed in justice. Because this time, justice had won. The end.